In the decades before the French Revolution, France did not look like a state falling apart. It raised taxes, it paid soldiers, it borrowed constantly. Life continued, administration functioned, credit flowed. From the outside, it looked strained but orderly, not prosperous, but not collapsing either. What few people recognized was that debt was no longer just something the state used in emergencies. It had become the system that quietly held everything together, and that was precisely what made it dangerous. By the late 18th century, France was not financially backward. It kept detailed accounts. It issued long-term state bonds. It relied on professional financiers and institutional creditors. Wars, infrastructure, and administration were increasingly funded through credit rather than immediate taxation. This was not improvisation. It was structure. Debt allowed the monarchy to operate beyond what annual revenue alone could support. It spread costs over time and tied the state's survival to the interests of those who held its promises. As long as confidence remained intact, the system worked smoothly, but it worked only under that condition. Debt created routine. Interest payments arrived on schedule. Future loans assumed past reliability. Credibility substituted for cash. When revenue fell short, borrowing filled the gap. When wars expanded costs, credit absorbed the shock. Emergencies became paperwork. Crisis became accounting. This made the state appear resilient, even modern. But routine did something subtle. It hid accumulation. Each solution pushed risk forward, not away. Paperwork only worked as long as belief remained uninterrupted. Stability was real but conditional. The crown did not owe everyone equally. It owed financiers who held bonds. It owed office holders whose salaries depended on state revenue. It owed institutions reliant on interest payments. These obligations created allies. As long as payments continued, creditors defended the system that paid them. Debt aligned powerful groups with the monarchy, not through loyalty, but through incentives. Governance ran on obligation rather than consent, but those obligations were not identical. Different groups needed different outcomes. Some wanted higher taxes, others wanted exemptions preserved, some wanted stability. Others wanted restructuring. Alignment was already beginning to fracture. Raising taxes was politically dangerous. Cutting privileges risked backlash. Reducing spending threatened order. Debt avoided those conflicts. Borrowing postponed decisions that challenged entrenched interests. Each loan delayed confrontation. Each promise narrowed the space for future reform. Postponement felt prudent, but postponement is not repair. Every obligation hardened the system. Choices disappeared quietly. What looked like careful management was also the slow loss of options. By the late 1780s, France was still functioning. Payments continued. Administration ran. Credit flowed thinly, but the margin for error had vanished. Debt no longer absorbed shocks, it magnified them. A missed payment no longer meant delay, it meant collapse of trust. The state was stable only if nothing changed, and different groups were about to demand incompatible changes. If debt made the system work, what happened when powerful groups realized the same obligations demanded opposite outcomes? If this way of understanding history, through incentives, constraints, and institutional trade-offs, feels natural to you, like the video and subscribe. This channel is built around that way of seeing. France did not have a single debt problem. It had several, all operating at once. The crown needed credit to function. Creditors needed payments to continue. Elites needed privilege protected. Ordinary people needed relief. Each group interacted with the same debt system, but their incentives pointed in different directions. What held the state together financially also pulled its politics apart. These incentives were not just different. They were increasingly incompatible. For the monarchy, debt was no longer a tool. It was survival. Taxes could not cover war costs, administration, and interest payments at the same time. Borrowing filled the gap. It delayed confrontations with privileged groups and avoided politically dangerous reforms. But debt came with discipline. Creditors expected reliability. Any threat to repayment raised borrowing costs or cut access entirely. So the crown prioritized honoring obligations, even when doing so weakened its ability to govern. Reform itself became risky. The state could no longer act strategically. It could only react. Nobles and clergy occupied a different position. Many were exempt from major taxes. Some were creditors themselves. Others benefited from a system that preserved privilege in exchange for cooperation. Reforms threatened that arrangement. Changes to taxation weakened privilege. Debt restructuring threatened creditor interests. Stability protected both, and privilege was not passive. It carried veto power. Reform triggered organized resistance, not quiet discomfort. The status quo was actively defended, not because it was fair, but because it was safe. Financiers did not want collapse. They wanted predictability. Their wealth depended on steady interest payments, not dramatic restructuring. Even inefficient systems could function, as long as obligations were honored. This created a constraint. Financiers supported the crown only while credibility remained intact. Any reform increased uncertainty, raised risk premiums, or threatened access to credit. Continuity lowered costs, change raised them. The more the state depended on credit, the less room it had to alter the system that provided it. For most people, debt was indirect. They did not hold bonds, they paid taxes. They felt pressure without seeing relief, but their pain was fragmented. Different regions faced different burdens. Grievances were real but uncoordinated. Suffering did not translate cleanly into political leverage. Debt kept pain dispersed. For now, every proposed reform solved one problem by creating another. Raising taxes threatened elites. Cutting spending threatened stability. Restructuring debt threatened credit. Each group defended its position rationally, but those positions could not all be satisfied at once. Debt did not unite interests. It locked them in opposition. Unified reform was no longer difficult. It was structurally impossible without rupture. This was not dysfunction by accident. Debt coordinated finance while fragmenting power. Each obligation pulled the state in a different direction. Consensus required breaking the very system that kept the state solvent. France could still function, but it could no longer change, and pressure was still accumulating. If the state could function but not adapt, how long could it survive before financial limits became political ones? By the late 1780s, France's problem was no longer abstract debt, it was cash flow. Interest payments consumed a growing share of state revenue year after year. War debts from earlier conflicts still demanded service. Tax exemptions narrowed the base. Borrowing continued to cover gaps, but only as long as lenders believed repayment was certain. Every obligation reduced flexibility. The state could still operate day to day, but discretion was already gone. Financial commitments no longer adjusted to political priorities. They dictated them. This was not a temporary squeeze. It was a structural condition. The crown no longer asked what policy was best. It asked which decision preserved access to credit. Missed payments raised interest rates. Higher rates reduced borrowing options. Fewer options deepened dependence. This inverted governance. Instead of politics shaping finance, finance began shaping politics. Decisions were filtered first through creditor reaction and only afterward through political justification. Policies were judged by whether they reassured lenders, not whether they solved problems. Fiscal survival replaced strategic choice. Attempts at reform did not expand options, they narrowed them. Each proposal angered at least one powerful group. Tax reform mobilized privilege. Spending cuts threatened administration. Debt restructuring frightened creditors. Partial reform satisfied no one. More importantly, each failure consumed credibility. Creditors began pricing uncertainty into every announcement. Every unsuccessful reform raised the cost of the next one. Reform itself became destabilizing. The act of trying to change the system made the system harder to stabilize. As financial options disappeared, authority eroded. The state could not raise taxes without consent. It could not secure consent without legitimacy. It could not restore legitimacy without reforms it could not pass. Finance and legitimacy became inseparable. What began as a budget problem transformed into a constitutional one. The question shifted from how to pay to who had the right to decide. Fiscal limits exposed political limits. Once legitimacy weakened, it could not be selectively restored. Calling the Estates General was not ideological ambition. It was necessity. Without broader consent, new taxes were impossible. Without new taxes, debt service failed. Without debt service, the state ceased to function. Debt forced the issue. Representation entered the system not to transform it, but because ordinary governance no longer worked under existing constraints. What had been postponed for decades could no longer be delayed. Once representation entered the system, control weakened. Routine gave way to debate. Expectations shifted. Creditors watched closely. Every delay increased uncertainty. Every disagreement raised doubt. Time itself became destructive. The state could not retreat. It could not advance. Waiting worsened both credit and legitimacy at the same time. Constraint hardened into paralysis. France was not bankrupt in theory. It was ungovernable in practice. Debt had narrowed the state's room to maneuver until every path led to confrontation. Fiscal tools triggered political conflict. Political solutions threatened financial collapse. The system still functioned, but it could no longer make decisions that preserved itself. If ordinary governance had become impossible, what kind of rupture could restore authority without tearing the state apart entirely? By the end of the 1780s, the French state was still standing, but it was no longer moving. Taxes arrived late, payments stalled, officials delayed decisions, not because they were confused, because every decision now broke something else. Debt had once coordinated the system. Now it interfered with everything it touched. Borrowing no longer bought time. Promises no longer reassured. Delay no longer stabilized anything. The machine still ran, but only in place. What years of postponement had avoided, reality now imposed. What followed was not a sudden burst of wisdom. It was arithmetic. For decades, borrowing had postponed conflict. Each loan delayed a fight. Each payment preserved calm. Until it didn't. New loans raised suspicion instead of confidence. Extensions weakened credibility instead of restoring it. Reassurance produced tighter conditions, not relief. This wasn't bravery replacing fear. It was constraint replacing choice. The state didn't discover a better plan. It ran out of plans that preserved the old order. Debt did more than strain finances. It broke decision-making. Raised taxes and privilege revolted. Challenge privilege and credit tightened. Lose credit and administration froze. Every normal tool triggered resistance somewhere else. Debt turned trade-offs into dead ends. To govern normally now meant financial failure. To govern decisively meant political rupture. There was no path that protected both. At this point, politics no longer shaped finance. Finance shaped politics. Budgets were written with creditors in mind first. Policies were judged by market reaction before public impact. Authority passed through confidence checks before it reached the people. The state no longer asked what France needed. It asked what lenders would tolerate. This didn't look dramatic, it looked procedural, and that made it harder to stop. Reform came too late and cost too much. Partial fixes satisfied no one. Each attempt angered a different group. Each failure raised the cost of the next attempt. Reform no longer expanded options. It consumed the last remaining credibility. Every move narrowed the field, until the system had nowhere left to go. This is where revolution enters. Not first as ideology, not first as violence, but as a coordination reset. The existing system could not realign incentives. It could not redistribute burdens. It could not renegotiate obligations. Revolution did what reform could not. It reset expectations. Old debts were questioned. Privileges were challenged. Authority was redefined. Pain became concentrated instead of quietly dispersed. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't orderly. But it restored the ability to act. The guillotine did not cause the breakdown. It followed it. First came fiscal paralysis, then political rupture. Violence escalated only after legitimacy collapsed, and replacement authorities struggled to stabilize the new order. Debt forced the break. Revolution expressed it. Violence followed when coordination failed to reform fast enough. The cause was structural, not emotional. France did not fall because it was poor. It fell because it was obligated beyond flexibility. Debt had allowed the state to survive pressure for decades, but by postponing reform, it concentrated strain, until rupture became the only adjustment left. The system did not fail at its weakest point. It failed where it had once been most effective. If you're drawn to history explained through incentives, constraints, and institutional trade-offs, not heroes or villains, like the video and subscribe. This channel is built around that way of seeing. Revolutions begin not when systems stop working, but when systems keep working in ways that make change impossible.